All right, I just want to thank again before we get started, and I won't take long, but I want to thank our speakers for being here. I think all of our attendees are familiar with their work. I just can't say thanks enough. They're both very sensitive to the needs of pre-K-12, huge advocates, and then of course research and authors who really get into the field, get down with the teachers, and understand exactly what all levels of educators are dealing with, not just with ELs, but in general. And they were so gracious to give us this opportunity to make sure as many people as possible could get this PD that we all need. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Stacy, for the invitation to do this. So I can go ahead and get us started. Ruslana and I have been collaborating for a few years now. And most recently, Ruslana was a researcher for WIDA and just recently left WIDA for another opportunity. And I was a consultant for WIDA in June 2020, I think it was, during my transition from the University of Miami to where I am now, Virginia Commonwealth University. And we're very happy to be able to join you today and talk about a functional approach to language development, which perhaps for some of you, most of you, this may be something new, but it's something that I have been involved in for the past 22 years or so, and actually learned about it when I was an undergrad student in Brazil. Since then, actually it's been a little bit longer than 22 years, but most recently, most of my work, graduate work, has focused on a functional approach to language development. So I'll let Ruslana tell a little bit more about how she came to this, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Welcome, everyone. I just want to say special hi to my friends Amy and Anne and others who, but I recognize some friends that I know from Minnesota and WIDA. So yes, very excited to talk about this work. While I was at WIDA, I was one of the writers of the standards, the new edition, and we brought in systemic functional linguistics with a team of us, including Gebhardt and Luciana and others who really wanted to contribute pedagogically useful theory of language. And and my work now focuses on supporting districts, 74 districts in southern Wisconsin. So with that, let's kick us off. Luciana, 1 second. Yes.
So we have a few outcomes for this session. We are going to introduce the new edition very briefly, describe the big ideas in the standards and the shifts that they facilitate, and also illustrate a functional approach to language and language development through examples of inform, explain, and argue in grades 1 and 10. Actually, it's going to be, I think we decided to take out one of the examples. So I think it's going to be the inform and argue examples that you're going to see today. And then we are going to provide some more resources for you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the outcomes. And so we will have time for discussing the ideas that we present. But first, we're going to dive in by talking about very quickly about the big ideas in the WIDA Standards Framework. I apologize. I actually had a major nosebleed this morning, and I have to turn off my video. I'm sorry for the distraction. The 4 big ideas in the WIDA standards are not new, but they are extremely important to highlight and focus on exactly the area of focus we want to highlight is we're going to talk about today, and the instructional shifts that they facilitate. Typically, you have seen the 4 big ideas that the WIDA standards represented as a rectangle, and they are language and functional approach to language are in the service of equity of opportunity and access to ELL. So we position equity at the center, and the other three ideas are around in the service of equity. Today, we're going to focus on the functional approach to language, and I like to say that we focus on equity every day. I apologize. And now we will talk about the instructional shifts that these big ideas facilitate. As I mentioned earlier, they're really not new, but some key focuses that we want to highlight are important. The first one is the equity of opportunity and access. This edition upholds the goal of increasing equity for MLLs by providing common and visible language expectations in relation to grade level academic content. And the key words there are common and visible language expectations. And so it's one set and not separated by language proficiency levels. Instead of the shift that it facilitates is, instead of differentiating down by levels of language proficiency, instruction should scaffold up by starting with a common set of language expectations and then designing instruction through macro and micro scaffolding. And we will illustrate that approach today, the teaching and learning cycle. The second big idea is the integration of content and language. And again, we have been talking about this in the TESOL field for many years, but we're still seeing that there is an importance for emphasizing that language is best learned in the service of disciplinary learning, not separate from content areas. And conversely, content cannot be learned without a sustained attention to language. The shift that this big idea supports is, if instead of separating language from the learning it serves, instruction should make use of language as a vehicle for and access to learning concepts, themes, issues, and phenomena in the disciplines and beyond. The third one is collaboration among stakeholders. Again, not a new idea, but we have to continue to do this work because it's essential for providing multilingual learners high quality experiences that are coordinated and comprehensive. And we need experts at all levels to provide those comprehensive services. And we've heard this a lot, right, in the TESOL field, where you are language specialists, you work with these kids, and we continue to say that this collaboration doesn't happen by magic, but school leadership should foster culture and put structures in place to allow teachers to co-plan, co-teach, and co-assess. The last big idea, and that's the one that, of course, you came here for today, is functional approach to language development. And the way I wrote about it in a recent article is, it's not a development of, like, it's not only a development of student sentences from shorter to longer, or from less complex to more complex, but an expansion of what students can do with language, how many spaces they can occupy, and how many conversations they can contribute to. And this shift facilitates the view of language, not an inventory of structures that need to be learned outside of context and all those past tense verbs and everything else and articles and possessives, but our instruction should expand students' repertoires in a variety of contexts through the years of schooling. And we wrote about this in more details in our article in the references. So Luciana will talk to us about the functional approach to language. And before she gets into the details, I just wanted to remind that a functional approach to language is in most of the components in the WIDA standards. And this should be a review for most of you, what the components of the standards are. It's in the introductory pages of the book. In particular, functional approach to language has mostly informed the key language uses through genre families and language expectations. And there is systemic functional linguistics is also in proficiency level descriptors, but we wanted to highlight genre families and language in use through key language uses and language expectations. So Luciana will talk to us about functional approach now.
Thank you, Ru. So as I mentioned right at the beginning, this may be a new idea to some of you or to most of you, but we have been actually working on this approach for a number of years. And systemic functional linguistics is a theory of language and also an approach to discourse analysis. And it also has a lot of implications for the classroom. And so we're using the terminology of functional approach to language development to really focus more on the pedagogical approach that we have used in classrooms, again, for many, many years. So Ru, next slide. So why are we talking about function here? The real focus is a simultaneous focus on language and meaning. And we're drawing a lot of our ideas from this book that I published with my former PhD advisor, Mary Schlepagro. Some of you may be familiar with her work too. She's a major scholar here in the US who focuses her work on systemic functional linguistics. So next. So you may want to think about a more traditional view of language versus a functional view of language. In a more traditional view of language, you teach language at the sentence level, and oftentimes you focus a lot on vocabulary, actually, right? That's coming later. Teaching language, what is different about the functional approach is that we are teaching language at the level of the whole text. We focus on discourse level, and we ask this question: what is the purpose of the text? And it could be written or oral or spoken. Second piece on traditional is thinking about teaching. Part of our profession in a long, long time. Think about those of you who teach writing. How many drafts have you corrected, quote unquote, and provided feedback on students' errors? And that's basically the feedback that students got, was on their error. And language toolkits. We talk about their linguistic repertoires. So we look at language in a very different way. So feedback on grammar becomes much less important. We are, again, thinking about language and content simultaneously. For a traditional view of language, you think of structures or vocabulary first. And in a functional approach, we are always talking about context. So context, purpose, topic, roles and relationships, and mode and channel of communication. So there is this relationship between language and context. Context of situation, where we are right now, for example, and context of culture, thinking about how we are part of different cultures. Structures without function in the traditional view of language. And in a functional view, we focus on function first, asking students, what does language do in the text, right? In this particular text or in texts in general. What do adjectives do in arguments? What does passive voice do in history texts? What do verbs do in narratives? So we're thinking about all these different questions that focus, again, on the function of different parts of speech, for example, to use a more traditional terminology here. So we focus on, and the functional approach helps empower. I can't read because the chat is, so the functional approach helps empower students to do more things with language, not just how to correct their sentences, how correct their sentences are. So this is very different from perhaps what enables a focus on meanings. It provides a meta language or a language for talking about language, for talking about the voices that authors make. Enables teachers to identify language patterns in order to help multilingual learners see how it looks. So we're always concerned about what role does language play in this particular text? can be implemented in any language and on systemic functional linguistics. And we're going to share some references, but this line, so it's language represents system networks, not an inventory of rules and structures. This approach supports the development of academic language, or the language used for schooling purposes, as existing on the same continuum as everyday language used for communicative purposes in everyday life. So it's not that we are contrasting academic language as being good and everyday language as being bad. We actually know that there are many, many things that students bring with their everyday language in any language that you can draw on for them to develop academic language. And academic language is much, much more than vocabulary. This is something that in all of my teacher education classes, I have to emphasize. So we use academic language. So using academic language includes a process of making academic dimensions of subject matter transparent. So we're very, very purposeful in talking about language for science, language for social studies, language for mathematics. And that's the terminology too that the WIDA standards include. Educators need to be knowledgeable about the language in and through which they're teaching, as they're faced with an additional task of scaffolding students' learning about not only content, but also language. And many scholars have shown how bridging between everyday and academic languages is essential for understanding of content. So these are some of the key ideas. Other key ideas relate to this notion of genre, represented by the culturally expected patterns of types of texts to explicitly focus on academic language development. So we use this definition of genre. Genre is a recurrent configuration of meanings described as a staged, goal-oriented social process. It is staged because it usually takes us more than one phase of meaning to work through a genre. So we talk about stages beyond introduction, body, conclusion. We actually name different parts of a text, different parts of the text. I'm trying to use more everyday terminology too, in different ways that relate more closely to their functions in the text or in that particular genre. So that's a really key point in understanding genre. It's goal-oriented because unfolding phases are designed to accomplish something, and we feel a sense of frustration, or social because we undertake genres interactively with others, right? We always have to think of audience. This approach differs significantly from process-oriented approaches common in many classrooms, such as Lucy Calkins' writing workshop. And for a discussion, I would recommend an article that Ruslana and Sharon Basser have published that is basically a Lucy Calkins writing workshop. And, you know, that has been very, very common in so many classrooms and is not appropriate for multilingual learners. We could do an entire other workshop about those issues. So I'm going to stop at that. I'm going to stop here, Ru, just for a little bit to see if there are questions that I can answer in the Q&A.
Sounds good.
No questions there, but if there are questions in the chat box, were there any questions? Can you give concrete examples of these concepts? Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also many, many examples in my book. This one, Focus on Grammar and Meaning. So any other questions or comments? If not, I'll go ahead and continue. So we use this concept of the teaching and learnings on the teaching of writing. So a genre-based approach to writing instruction uses what we call the teaching and learning cycle. So and go to the next one.
Okay.
So we always want to provide students with different topics, even before they go into, let's say, a unit. What we want to do is build their content knowledge of the topic. And we can do that through something that we call detailed reading. And we focus on 3 different areas of meaning. So we focus on content, relationships, and organization. So if you are a little bit familiar with systemic functional linguistics, this is a more, let's say, a friendlier way to think about the different meta functions. We call them meta functions. So here we're talking about content, relationships, and organization. Whenever we speak or write, we are always doing that with some sort of content. We are enacting relationships, right? So as I speak here with you today, we are enacting relationships, and we're organizing information in some way. So these 3 areas are really, really important for students to know in terms of both reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So for content, we focus on what is happening. Who are the people and things involved? Hold on just a second. What are the circumstances surrounding events? For relationships, we focus on this question: what are the roles and relationships taken up by participants? And for organization, we ask, how is the text organized and structured, and how is the language used? And for these 3 areas of meaning, we have different parts of language that we analyze, that we look at. And those are some of the examples that we're going to provide. For the teaching and learning cycle, in terms of the teaching of writing, the first phase, Ru, is what we call text deconstruction or modeling. We have the teacher modeling and student learning about the language of the text. So we typically use what we call mentor texts to help our students understand how language is being used in that particular genre. So that's when the teacher is in front of the room highlighting, really looking at specific areas of the text that are going to be important for students to focus on. Then we have what we call joint construction or guided practice. That's when the teacher and students build a text together as a class. So what you do is you can have students in groups brainstorming ideas for the joint construction, things like that. But the teacher is the one scribing. Everyone is writing in the classroom, but the teacher is in front of the room scribing. Everybody's talking, providing ideas. What comes first? Should we use it or should we use another word? What are the different words we can use here? You know, that particular phase, joint construction, is extremely important for our multilingual learners and is something that is really missing in a lot of classrooms. So next, you could put the next 2 together, Ru. Thank you. Okay. So collaborative and yes, thank you. So collaborative construction or shared practice is kind of an additional phase that we have added and other scholars have added, especially those of us who work with elementary students, for them to have an opportunity to work together in groups or in pairs before they write independently. So you can see here that this model, this teaching and learning cycle applied to the teaching of reading and writing is very much scaffolded. We don't ask students to write about their summer vacation, for example. We use shared experiences for students to write about something that they really know about. And you are responsible as a teacher to help them develop that content knowledge, to help them develop the knowledge of genre, the knowledge about the language. So we use the principle of guidance through interaction in the context of shared experiences. It's not here, but Ru can type it for us there. So guidance through interaction in the context of shared experiences. We don't want to ask our students to write about their summer vacations because maybe Ruslana was able to go visit her family in Ukraine during the summer. How exciting. But Stacy had to stay at home helping her parents do something, right? So the different experiences that they are bringing to write about your summer vacation, very, very different. So we want to provide these shared experiences for our students. I can go on and on and on about that because that's my topic of research, but I'll stop there and move on to the next slide.
1 second, Lou. Before you move on, I wanted to mention something, make something very explicit, that the notion of mentor texts and the notion of deconstruction and joint construction doesn't just happen in English language arts when kids are writing opinion pieces. We provide mentor text of science explanations, of social studies arguments, of any genre within the discipline. So we extend the notion of mentor text into the disciplines because the writing in the disciplines is a very challenging task when you have to use writing to communicate your knowledge. Okay, let's go next.
So very briefly, again, the 3 areas of meaning: content, relationships, and organization, or constructing a cohesive message. We have different questions to guide your language discussion. Again, as a teacher, you would have to prepare this in advance to help your students really get to the different parts, there's different areas of meaning. And the focus of the language is on what we call sentence constituents. We focus on participants, which are typically your noun groups, processes, which are typically your verbs, and circumstances, which can be adverbs, they could be time markers, many things. For relationships, we look at what we call mood choices. So is the sentence in the declarative mood, interrogative, or imperative? And we also look at modality, not just the modal verbs, but also things like, how, like grading, for example. If I say, I am so sorry, this so has a very significant role in the sentence, right? It's different than saying I'm sorry. You also have, again, different words, different language chunks that express modality. We also look at cohesive messages or organization. For this, we look at what we call theme new. Some of this is explained in the WIDA standards. We don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail, but how a sentence starts is really relevant for us to be thinking about texts. So if I use a word such as unfortunately, I am not able to, this unfortunately is a very important piece of that particular sentence and perhaps of the whole text. So we track how, beginning of sentences, end of sentences happen from one sentence to the next in texts. I have written a lot about this in terms of looking at history, science. So we call this like zigzag structuring. So it's just a fascinating area. And also cohesion. So what are those reference devices that you can help students work with? That's one area. There's also what we call lexical cohesion, like how different words are introduced and then you can track them within a text. So that is really a very interesting area for understanding text and really tracking words, tracking participants. and things like that. So, this piece is really, really critical for a functional approach.
Yes,
Next.
and I just wanted to add that a lot of the terms that are mentioned here are defined in the WIDA glossary in section 4 of the book, including detailed examples and explanations of cohesion and theme and new. And we wrote this glossary as a teaching tool and not just a dictionary of items, but more as a learning opportunity for teachers to see language through functional perspective. And so now I'm going to take us into key language uses in the WIDA standards. So as you've noticed from the standards components that I introduced earlier, we start, and in the old edition, you know, we had the language of science, social studies, and the core content areas. And then we would jump straight into the MPIs, which were the 5 levels, and there were some functions: identify, describe. Now we have added a layer of context, because within science, you can do many things with language. And so the purpose for language is realized now through the key language uses. Are students explaining, narrating, informing, or arguing? And of course, there is a lot more language uses, but when we were writing standards, we had to make strategic choices, because when you write standards, you can't list everything. It's just, it's not the function of standards, but you have to choose high leverage language uses. And so on this slide, the 4 key language uses that show up pretty much in any content area, and they serve variety of purposes. Narratives, even in science, can communicate conceptual phenomena or stories about evaporation and condensation, etc. So we drew on systemic functional linguistics informed genre families to define key language uses. So narrate is to represent experiences through stories and histories. They're real or imagined, and they're not just your short stories and fictional narratives, but they're also recounts. They're histories, which are autobiographies, biographies, empathetic biographies, historical recounts. And more details about this slide is again in the section 4 of the book. There is charts and tables that I wrote to really elaborate and help us see genres than more than, oh, we do narratives. You know, once you start unpacking narratives in these pages, you will see so many more nuanced ways of looking at text. The next one is inform, and it's to convey factual information about a concept or a phenomenon or a topic. We talk about them as reports of different kinds. Oops, sorry, I hit the bar accidentally. Descriptive reports, like all about sharks, classifying different classes of fish, comparative, how are sharks similar, different from other fish? And the reason we are so nuanced about this is because those 3 bullet points are realized through different language choices. And so classifying and how the whole text is organized is very different from a descriptive report to a classifying report. Descriptive report, you can move paragraphs around, and it doesn't matter if you start with a habitat or a diet, but with classifying, it's a class and subclass. So it's an eye-opening experience to dig into genres. Explanations, or the key use of explain, is to give account of how or why things work. This is super different, I would say, from informing, because the way information reports are defined are more telling facts or definitions or classifications of things, but not really digging into the underlying causes of how magnetism works, of why volcanoes erupt. So we, from the work of a lot of initially Australian linguists in the schools, but now in the more than 20 years, this work has been happening in the United States, where we look at explanations like sequential, causal, cyclical, and and how different texts are organized, because it's and I will illustrate today a cyclical explanation in a first grade context versus a causal explanation. And so it's helpful to have this more nuanced way of really making genre knowledge known to yourself as a teacher, so that in turn you can make it accessible to your learners. And then in history particular, we have factorial and consequential explanations. The last one is argue, and it's to justify one's claims using evidence and reasoning. And because of the slide dimensions, we couldn't list more, but in the section 4 that I referenced, I think I have like about 8 bullets that define on page 219. Like book review is a genre because you have to take a position where you like or don't like the book, and then you provide evidence for your opinion. In that case, theme interpretation essay is an argument. So you take a theme in the book and you prove that from the text, this is the theme in the book. 1 or 2 sided arguments, pros and cons are there too. And then science and math arguments. The science are typically the CER, claim, evidence, reasoning, and math arguments are fascinating things. And if you're doing math arguments, write to me, because it's hard to find math genres, and a lot of them are very spoken. So when we talk about genres, we also talk about multimodal, spoken, and other texts. So I'm very excited to talk about this text. Maybe even the teacher that I worked with is in the one of the participants. So this is a first grade text that she supported students' language development of, and all of our learning was literally through Facebook Messenger. There was no dedicated professional development. She reached out and she said, help me see language in this text. Where is the language in cyclical explanations? So we look at the text from how do we orient the reader through, first, how do we orient the reader in a cyclical explanation? We just have a simple sentence. The life cycle of a bean passes through many stages. Or you can say the life cycle of a bean has many stages. So you orient the reader. You don't jump into the seed and the embryo, but you orient. And then you provide details. Where do details live? Often in explanations and informing texts, details live in noun groups. And noun groups are groups of words that have a head noun and then words that come before and often after. So in this case, the noun groups are the life cycle of a bean. That's one noun group. The head noun is cycle. And you don't just say a life cycle. You want to say life cycle of a bean. And that provides more detail. And then these details also provide give information about what is changing. So because as the bean undergoes the change, the word for the what undergoes the change, the language of that changes. So it's a bean, it's a seed, a bean plant, there is roots, the skin, a plant, a greenish white sprout. And because it just came out from the earth and it hasn't gotten the chlorophyll, so it's greenish white, and maybe a little yellow, and then it becomes a plant with bright green leaves. So all of these details are important. And other details live in the blue text, the so-called circumstances. They are language of place and language of time. So inside tiny bean pods, or down into the soil and up towards the sun. And we also highlight the verbs because the verbs communicate change. Starts, it's in green. Reach, splits as it pushes, becomes, turns into, reaches. And then there is, of course, the sequential language, which is like first, second, third, or finally. But here we have 2 weeks later. and first graders can learn 2 weeks later instead of next. And the way this teacher approached this work is through focusing on different language features that were relevant to this genre. So see, all the language teachers in genre oriented, and there's a lot of talk, a lot of drawing, manipulative, standing in the circle, acting out the cycle, not just copying words from the board. But when I presented this scaffolding for the teacher, this is where the functional clicked for her, because then we were looking at verbs not just as parts of speech, but we're looking at verbs as resources for communicating change. And these verbs were so rich in her text. She showed me text, and I said, so expose your kids to a lot of text and make a chart like this. Do we hear verbs that show change? Let's add it to our word wall. And I'm not going to read all of them just for the sake of time, but then when you also read text, then do we hear language of place, of where the change happens? I just love these words, you know, down into the soil and up towards the sun. It's just not just teaching antonyms, but teaching where things happen through prepositional phrases. And then language of sequence, of course, and all of this language comes from the books you have in your library. So bring them to your classroom, group them by the genre, and begin to do language detective work with the students. And then finally, the noun groups that are fairly simple in first grade, but they're important, and they're in red in the last column. The green leaves, the small acorn, the yellow pollen, the growing tree. And of course, these words are from different life cycles about different things, beans and acorns, but it doesn't matter because kids are exposed and they're learning language of about different plants.
Rue, can you leave that there? I have a couple of comments in to answer some of the questions that are in the Q&A. So this chart here shows you that academic language is much, much more than vocabulary.
Yeah.
So if I taught my student moist just by itself, pre-teaching the word moist would be very different when I talk about the language of change or action verbs or being verbs, you know, the relating verbs. Is growing moist, splits open. If I just teach my students split, is very different from when I teach my students language chunks and how these language chunks function within specific texts. So what you have up here as the labels, you can have what is undergoing the process of X. In this particular text, it's the process of change. For this particular text, we have sequence of time, so sequential connectors will be important. It's not going to be for every single text. So your labels, the way you do something like this, as we're providing it as an example, your tables will be highly dependent on the text or the texts that you're using with your students. So something that is more explanatory, that does not involve, that has a lot of definitions, will look very differently from what we have here. For example, language of change, the action verbs that talk about the change, that's going to be different as well. You will have different types of verbs, and in the WIDA standards, you have several different types of verbs that you can refer to. We don't have enough time to go into that, but so what is really important is for you to be thinking functionally about the text that you're using with your students.
Yes, thank you, Lou, for adding that. And another activity that I want to make explicit here is that in my work with teachers, we use color coding. So the noun groups are red and language of sequence can be whatever, but usually I have this kind of a color coding schema to help kids see the verbs that are needed here are green, the circumstances or language of place and time is blue, and the noun groups are red, and then sequential language can be yellow or purple. And kids can cut up sentences and they put them together so that they learn sentences within the context of text, within the context of genre, and not sentences separate, because we have them and we need sentences. Sentences serve the purpose of the whole text. And in this case, it's this, oops, 1 second. It's the text up here. So, however, what I want to say is that the finished product may not look like written text written by a teacher. The finished product may look like this, which is a diagram. But a lot of language has been developed. A lot of language has been used in the conversations. So it's reading, talking, analyzing, and then constructing a diagram at the end, because cyclical explanations in most cases are diagrams. Learning how to construct diagrams is its own literacy, because you need to know how the cycle works, and whether you need labels or they're optional, whether you need arrows if they're optional, like that. So now Luciana will talk about contrasting text from 10th grade.
And Ru, so this is another example that we have. I don't think I'm going to actually go over it because we're at 4:51 and I want to give people time for questions and for us to answer them. So we'll be happy to share this example with you. And also we have another example in our publication that also has an annotated text. And I've done other presentations with more annotated texts with some of my PhD students, my research group. And so I'm going to skip this. I think people got a very good sense from what you shared. So let's go to the next one.
Yeah. Okay, 1 second here.
So I can go over this really quickly. So we want to start with your content area standards. You identify the main key language use, find the set of language expectations for that key language use for your grade level, plan a series of chained lessons to meet the language functions, and focus on the language features that serve those functions. I'm going to share with you a sample lesson plan that I have used for a long time, and it has this focus on both language and content. I think you should be able to get that. It's in one of my journal articles, which I will share as well. But it has one of the frameworks that I've developed using a functional approach to language development, which is called LACI, a language-based approach to content instruction. So I have several publications that I can share as well. Okay, next, some conclusions, considerations. You should definitely use the annotated texts in the WIDA Standards Framework that most closely match your objectives. So the annotated texts could actually function as some of your mentor texts. If you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to find mentor texts, you should definitely use those. Find or write a mentor text to work through with students, focusing on the most prominent language functions and features. Expose students to a variety of texts and make a running record of language they will need for their own writing of that genre. Again, language chunks, not vocabulary words. Choose 1 or 2 features that are most important to make visible for your students. For example, connectors, noun groups, clauses, and connect them to their functions in the text. And design lessons and activities that draw students' attention to those language functions and features. So let's share the resources, Ru.
Here we go.
So the first article there, Planning an Application Using LACI, was published in the MiniTiso Journal. And if you just Google my name, spelled correctly, please, with MiniTiso Journal, you'll get this article. And that's where the lesson plan format is. And this a framework for focusing on both language and content around what I call 6 C's of support for scaffolding. The second one is the article that Ru and I published on a functional approach to language development that really describes basically some of the key concepts that we shared today are there in this. Then Ru, can you talk about your
Yeah,
piece?
sorry, I was responding to a comment because people actually can't click the links that we provide into the chat.
That's true, they cannot. So
maybe copy
they
them.
can't click on the links we provide in the chat? That's weird.
So yeah, someone says they can click. Okay, well, other people are
you
helping
can
out.
in the
Great.
chat. I don't think you can in the presentation, obviously, but in the chat you can.
I think I'd rather maybe just leave 6 minutes for questions, and then they just can check out these papers.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so we have just a little bit of time left for questions, and we have more references here, and the recording will be available.
So Rachel asked, is there any concise resource that would explain why the US has been so slow to employ SFL? So yeah, I can give you a history of this, which I do in my own classes on discourse analysis, but I think it has been Chomsky's influence as a theory of language that people know most closely. And it wasn't until people like Ruslana started really learning more about SFL. You know, it wasn't until the publication of Mary Schlepper-Groh's book, The Language of Schooling, in 2004, that we actually have seen SFL in the US kind of boom. And you can I can literally trace who started to work on SFL and then their students and where they are in the US and what they have done to move the conversation forward. So it's been slow in terms of change, but we're very hopeful with the WIDA standards, with the work that WIDA has been doing in general, and all of us together, right? All of us SFL scholars in the US, what we have done together to move this forward. So it's a really exciting time, but that's a little summary of why I think it's been kind of slow, but all in its due time, I would say.
Oh, Michelle is asking a question about weaving SFL and translanguaging. Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for being here. Yes, translanguaging and SFL really work well together because SFL works with the notion that language is a resource. So I think one of my favorite articles where this concept is illustrated is in Nihal Kota's article, and that one is published, I think, as a chapter, and I've posted it on my Linguistics for Social Justice Facebook group, where kids bring in their resources in both building the field in the teaching and learning cycle, where you build the knowledge of the field, and then when you deconstruct or jointly construct text, you are allowed to draw on your resources to bring to the conversation as the context requires. So you can translanguage in any phase of the teaching learning cycle. You can use translanguaging as you compose your text for the audience that finds that appropriate and meaningful. So I would check out his article. It's about culturally sustaining pedagogies. And if as a learner of SFL since 2014, I have used my Facebook group to process a lot of the learning and sharing resources, and it's called Linguistics for Social Justice on Facebook. I think that's the name of it. It has gone through a few iterations, but I do see linguistics as a tool for social justice the way Halliday saw it, the father of SFL. So thanks so much for being here and for asking that question.
Yeah,
Any
and
more
we
questions?
have
Thanks, Allison.
we have several people asking about how to introduce the functional approach to teachers. And, you know, you can always get in touch with me. And I've been doing this for the past 20 years, as I mentioned, and working in teacher education for 15, and have worked with both elementary and secondary teachers. Amy asked the question, is it different for elementary and secondary? And my quick answer is yes, it is. And I've worked with many teachers across the US in several different states. And I have found also changes and different attitudes, I would say, towards language and towards content knowledge development. And so I have developed different strategies for this kind of work. So feel free to get in touch with me. And Ruslan and I are also available for further work if you're interested. And I think we're at 5 o'clock, but we're happy to stay a little bit longer if you would like, maybe another 5-10 minutes. I'm happy to stay if people are able to stay.
I just want to mention, I'll be leading a book study by Pauline Jones and Bev Deriganka starting in February, and I posted a link in the chat. And there will be 6 sessions, and you can register if you want. It's at 4 p.m. Central. And their resource offers a lot of mentor texts and ways of really looking at language in the context of text. And if you want to see it again, it's Deriganka and Jones, Teaching Language in the Context. Teaching Language in Context, that's it. Couldn't read upside down.
And also, I'm working on a book that should be out with Routledge early next year, 2023, which will be based on Lacey, and a functional approach is a big part of the book with my C of code breaking. So if you're interested, be on the lookout for that early next year as well.
Are you able to see the Q&A as well? I think you were in there.
Yes, I've been trying.
I think you've hit on everything, but.
Someone raised her hand or their hand. Was that, did I see that correctly? Send us a chat if we missed your raised hand. Yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming. And
there's still questions coming through the chat. So pedagogical English grammar book, Humphrey, Droga and Humphrey, Humphrey and Droga, you have that root there, Z. There you go. Grammar Mini by Humphrey, there you go. So it's out of Australia. It's really hard to get it here. So
it's hard to get it. You have to get it from the Australian publisher, and it's don't get it on Amazon. I think it's ridiculously expensive there.
It is, but it's a really good resource. Yes. We don't have one that we have right now here.
Yeah, Jennifer, I see you said your bookstore works with the publisher. Yeah, ask for Grammar and Meaning by Sally Humphrey and Louise Droga and Susan Fees.
Yeah, that's the one I would recommend.
Yeah, it's my
I'm glad Rue had it right there.
Yep, they're all here. They're all here, left and right side of my desk. So thanks everyone.
There have been several questions about a list of terms or list of words used to refer to specific parts of a written text.
Yes, so I replied to that in the chat box, not here.
Oh, great.
I gave a reference to one of my articles that actually WIDA has drawn on for their genre piece in the standards. The reference in the standards, unfortunately, is incorrect, and I've asked folks to correct that. The one I gave in the chat is the correct one. So in this publication, I have a table with genres, purpose, expectations, typical language features, and the different stages of different genres. And they're classified by genre family out of Common Core, basically. It's not exactly aligned to WIDA because when I published this, WIDA wasn't out yet, so it doesn't have the same terminology. Plus, we use nouns to describe genre families. WIDA is using verbs. So it's not 100% aligned, but it's pretty much very close. So let me know if you would like that publication, or even I can just email you the table, to be honest with you. I'm happy to do that. So I answer that question. Let me type the answer. Let me type that. Yeah, there.
I'll be sure with any certificates that we send to send a list of all the links they've shared in the chat so that you have like one place.
Yeah, we need a list of resources or something like that, Stacey.
Wonderful resources.
Yeah. And pretty much everything that we have drawn on for this presentation is in our publications. So we're not going to be sharing the slides with folks, but you know, all the information is in our publications.
The first great example with the life cycle, I'm gonna write later, publish later. It's not published, but you know, you'll have a recording. Thanks. Yes, you can use the publications. I hope they are open access in the open access journals, which is great.
Yes.
No, the book study sessions will not be recorded, Beth. I actually haven't thought about that, if that's an option, but they are, maybe they should be. So let me get back to you. I think it's a great idea.
Maybe they should be, Rue. I will not be participating because unfortunately I just don't have time.
That's okay, but I asked Pauline and she's available. Isn't that awesome?
That is awesome.
Yeah, Bev is moving houses, but she might stop by for a Q&A.
Awesome. If you'd like to email me, I'm going to give you my Gmail because that one I don't get as many messages in. So it's Dr. D. That's how people call me at the university, Dr. D. edu 2006@gmail.com.
And I posted mine above to westronruslan@gmail.com.
So yeah, feel free to email us for more resources. Those of you asking about secondary, so my original work, actually my PhD work, was in secondary, but I've been mostly working at the elementary level for the past 15 years or so. But the first 6 years of my work on functional approach was really at the secondary level. So I have publications K through 12 in all content areas: science, math, social studies, and English language arts. And so I'm happy to share them. There's one that was published in 2010 that is about this theme new for the third area of meaning, the organization or constructing a cohesive message that may be of interest. I'll put the link in the chat box when I find it. It's called Nouns in History.
Oh, I love that article.
Yeah,
I was just gonna mention it, and
that's funny. And it's also available online.
Yeah, it's available online.
Yeah.
You know which one I can't find is your article where you're doing critical reading of history texts, and I think, oh, you wrote it for history teacher. That's why I thought you wrote it for TESOL, but you wrote it for history teacher, and it's a critical reading of history texts through 3 guiding questions. I'm gonna find it because I absolutely love that.
Yeah, for some reason it's not showing up as a link, like as a PDF. You have to log in now. It used to be available online, but apparently it's not anymore. I'll give you the link anyway. And if you can't find that, this is a link. It's not a link to where it was available before, but
no, they moved it. I know. I was just looking it up recently.
too bad.
So it's on JSTOR. You found it on JSTOR, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not available. Freely
Uncovering
available.
Human Agency. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's simple one. Let me share that one too.
I
That
have
one
it
is available.
ready.
Human Agency.
It's very simple, but it's very powerful in what it does.
Yeah, that one is for
Sometimes-
teaching history.
Yeah, it's very simple, but it's just such a powerful work.
Oh, you shared it. Okay, great.
Of reading texts critically and knowing how that criticality works through language, and not just content, but really the language choices the authors make in historical texts should not be taken as the holy grail, but they're their choices that they made for a particular purpose. Yeah, great, Susan.
Yes.
I'm gonna drop in a link for Mary Schleppergrell's brand new website, Read,
Oh,
Inquire, Write.
yes, that's great.
So Read, Inquire, Write is from University of Michigan. That's a phenomenal website to teach argumentation in history. 3 different kinds of arguments: the interpretations, critique, and counter argument. And the website is organized by those 3 genres of arguments. And there are mentor texts, and it's free because it was funded by a grant, and it's written by teachers and Professor Chauncey Montesano and Mary Schleppergrell. And there are resources for bilingual learners.
And I just put in a link to my CV. It's very long, but if you go to page 8, that's where my publications start. And I have all of them in electronic format or some kind of shareable format. So if you email me, I'm happy to send those to you, or one of my graduate assistants will. So I'm happy to share any of the things that I have already published. And Rue as well. So we have lots of resources. Hey, Jane. I saw your name earlier. Nice to see you. Or see your name. Okay, I think we're ready to go if there are no more questions. So we appreciate everybody. About half of the people who joined stayed for the extra 12 minutes that we've been here. So we appreciate you all.
Miss you.
Yeah.
I had to do
Thanks, Amy.
I had to
Yes.
say hi to Amy. Bye.
Amy is wonderful.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone.
Yes. Bye.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate
so
you.
much, Stacy, for organizing it and getting us together and pushing us to
Yes.
actually do it. And
I'm
yes,
just like
we
so happy to
appreciate.
have you. Just best thing ever. So I really appreciate you. I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate you.